Prayer was never meant to be the fragile interface people turned it into. For centuries, the story was told as if humans were designed to kneel, plead, and hope that a distant power might answer. But the older teachings, the banned manuscripts, and the quiet hints woven throughout the surviving texts all point in a different direction, one that feels less like religion and more like a system architecture the world forgot how to operate. In that forgotten design, what people call prayer was simply the default interface for connecting consciousness to its source. Not a request. Not a negotiation. A protocol. When Elias, the wandering healer whose name never made it into the later council's approved canon, stood before a lifeless body in a stone courtyard, he didn't whisper anything under his breath. He didn't bargain with heaven. He didn't collapse under the weight of grief or fear or urgency. Instead, he lifted his gaze, as if aligning himself with something invisible, and spoke with the strange confidence of someone who wasn't trying to reach a god but activating a channel already open. "I thank you that you have heard me," he said, not in future tense, not in hope, but in the calm recognition that the signal had already been transmitted long before his lips moved. That moment confused the scribes who documented the event. They weren't used to verbs shaped this way. They knew rituals, petitions, hymns, offerings. They didn't know what to do with a man who wasn't asking for anything. Later redactors softened the language, added piety, smoothed the tone. But the core remained. Elias wasn't praying. He was calling. Calling what? The manuscripts describe it with metaphors the later church found too destabilizing to preserve: the root light, the silent source, the field behind the field. But in the Gnostic circles surrounding the desert monasteries, they used a cleaner word borrowed from earlier mystics: the monad. Not a god above the sky, not a celestial ruler, not a personality at all. More like the primal field all consciousness arises from, the origin state behind every thought, every breath, every atom. To call the monad wasn't to summon an entity, it was to step back into alignment with the awareness that makes existence possible. The strange thing is that Elias insisted anyone could do it. He taught it to those close to him in small gatherings near riverbeds and abandoned shrines. He never framed it as something exclusive, but he also didn't broadcast it widely, because he understood the response it would provoke from the powers who maintained order through fear and hierarchy. If someone learns that the source is already inside them, if they learn that the interface is built in, not granted, then no institution can mediate it. And that makes institutions nervous. The courtyard miracle was the clearest demonstration of his method. Before he commanded the lifeless man to rise, Elias didn't generate faith, he tuned his awareness. Those watching saw him fall silent, not in hesitation but in calibration. His breathing slowed, his shoulders released tension, his attention dropped inward as though he were listening to something behind the world. Then the acknowledgement came, "You always hear me." With that sentence he wasn't addressing a distant being, He was acknowledging the completion of the alignment. The signal was already flowing. Then came the command, sharp, clear, almost startling in its certainty, rise. Not a hope. Not an attempt. An execution of a function. It wasn't magic. It wasn't divine intervention. It was the result of a consciousness fully aligned with its origin, issuing a directive into a reality that had forgotten how malleable it truly is. The Gnostic circles later wrote that the monad responds not to words, but to states. The words were just the audible residue of an internal shift. What most people missed was how different this was from every other form of worship. Elias didn't say, "Please let this happen." He didn't say, "If it is your will." He spoke as someone who understood the architecture, someone who knew that creation wasn't governed by petition but by recognition. He wasn't bending reality, he was restoring its original instruction. This is why so many gatekeepers feared the teaching. If you can call the monad through recognition instead of prayer, then you no longer kneel before the systems that claim to speak for it. You no longer fear the intermediaries who say you must earn access through them. You no longer accept the idea that you are powerless. And when enough people stop believing they are powerless, entire hierarchies collapse. What the later transcripts of Elias's teaching suggest is that calling the monad is less like asking a favor and more like tuning a radio to the correct frequency. The signal is always present, but most minds are drowned in static, fear, distraction, emotional turbulence, internalized shame, patterns inherited from a world built to keep people small. The act of calling isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It is a soft, subtle shift inside the chest, a moment in which awareness reorients from fragmentation back toward unity. That shift can feel like warmth spreading through the spine, or like silence suddenly blossoming behind the ribs, or like a subtle drop in the weight of the world. The physical body responds instantly, breath deepens, heartbeat steadies, eyes focus differently. Elias explained that these changes weren't spiritual signs but biological ones. The human nervous system is wired to reflect the state of the consciousness inhabiting it. When the signal strengthens, the body becomes lighter, clearer, more coherent. The story of the courtyard is preserved in fragments across different manuscripts, but the core sequence appears consistently: recognition, acknowledgement, command. It's almost algorithmic. Elias never framed it as doctrine. He framed it as a built-in capability, one that every human carries but few ever activate. Over time, the institutions that replaced his circle tried to reinterpret his actions as exceptions, miracles granted only once and only to him. But the whispers in the desert monasteries, the scrolls hidden in clay jars, the chants that survived in coded form, all insist the opposite. The interface was never broken. It was forgotten. And the reason it was forgotten wasn't human weakness. It was interference. Those who benefited from a powerless population, spiritual, political, metaphysical, worked tirelessly to teach people a version of prayer that disabled the interface instead of activating it. Elias's way bypassed them entirely. The truth is simple and unsettling. Calling the monad is not a request upward, it's a return inward. Elias demonstrated it openly once, knowing the risk, because he believed the world needed at least one visible example of a human using the interface correctly. Most people remember the command that raised the dead. Almost no one remembers the sentence that made it possible. I thank you that you have heard me. The call was already complete. Authority was never meant to be borrowed. Elias taught that every human carries an intrinsic strand of origin light woven into their awareness, but most people never learn how to access it because they were trained to relate to the source as servants, not participants. The councils that shaped the public version of the faith emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and dependence, because a population that believes it must request power will never realize it already has it. That is the quiet architecture behind centuries of spiritual conditioning. Keep people speaking the language of petition, and they will never discover the language of command. But Elias's closest circle learned a different structure, one built on recognition, not subservience. When he spoke of the monad, he never described it as a personality that needed appeasement or negotiation. He described it as the fundamental awareness beneath all forms, the field that generates existence itself. To recognize the monad was to recognize one's own origin. And from that recognition arose authority, not the kind granted by institutions, but the kind that flows naturally when a being remembers where it comes from. He often illustrated this by using a simple metaphor. A lamp plugged into its source doesn't need permission to shine. The moment the connection is clear, the light appears. The problem, he said, is that most minds are full of static, old beliefs, inherited fear, internalized shame, and the constant interference of the unseen forces that benefit from human disconnection. These forces weren't demons in the theatrical sense, but patterns of consciousness that thrive on fragmentation. Later mystics called them Archons. Elias called them the noise. Equals. The noise convinces people to speak the language of smallness. I am unworthy. I am separated. I must beg. I must earn. But when someone shifts into recognition, when they feel the quiet truth that they were never separate from the source, the entire linguistic structure collapses. Petition becomes unnecessary. Fear becomes irrelevant. And authority emerges not as domination, but as clarity. Elias once gathered his students in a quiet, abandoned marketplace after dusk. Lanterns flickered between broken stalls, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. He stood beside a fallen pillar and asked them to listen, not to him, but to the silence behind their heartbeat. The source is not above you, he said. It is beneath your breath. Then he guided them through what later mystics would call the three keys: recognition, authority, and command. The first key, recognition, required no words. It was a shift of attention inward, like turning one's awareness around and facing the origin instead of the world. A softening. A remembering. Some described it as warmth rising through their spine. Others felt a sense of expansion behind the ribs. Elias told them the sensation didn't matter, the clarity did. He reminded them that the monad wasn't something they summoned, it was something they remembered. The second key, authority, was the most difficult for many. Years of conditioning had taught them to bow, to plead, to wait for signs. Authority required them to stand. Not physically, but internally. Elias explained that authority wasn't arrogance. Arrogance is insecurity wearing a mask. True authority is quiet, relaxed, unshakable. It is the natural posture of a consciousness aligned with its source. One woman named Adara asked how she would know if she had accessed that authority. Elias smiled and told her she already had. The moment you stop asking whether you have it, he said, you do. He explained that authority isn't a feeling, it's an orientation. A way of being. When someone remembers they are rooted in the monad, their words stop trembling. Their breath deepens. Their decisions become simple. The world feels less like a labyrinth and more like a room they already understand. The third key, command, was the one the councils later tried hardest to erase. They replaced it with supplication, repentance, ritual, anything that would keep people from realizing they were designed to speak reality into alignment. Elias made it clear that command was not force. It wasn't coercion. It wasn't the ego trying to bend the universe to its will. Real command was the transmission of a clear signal from a consciousness fully plugged into its origin. When the interface is aligned, the command is simply the final step in an energetic sequence. He demonstrated it that night without theatrics. A storm had been gathering beyond the ridge, clouds layered like dark stone. The wind had been rising in sharp pulses, scattering dust through the marketplace. Elias closed his eyes, accessed the three keys in silence, and then spoke softly, not to the sky, but from the clarity within him, "Be still." The wind relaxed instantly. The lantern flame steadied. The sky shifted, not dramatically, not like a myth embroidered by scribes, but subtly, as if responding to a command spoken on the correct frequency. His students stared in stunned quiet, but Elias didn't revel in their awe. He told them that awe was the mind's first defense against recognition. "If you believe what I do is impossible," he said gently, "you will never learn to do it." He explained that commands issued without recognition are empty. Commands issued without authority are brittle. But when the three keys align, reality listens. This is what frightened the gatekeepers. They understood that a person who calls the monad through recognition cannot be controlled. A person who issues commands from authority cannot be managed through fear. And a person who aligns with the source cannot be coerced into systems that feed on human disconnection. Institutions maintain power by mediating access to meaning. Elias removed the mediator. Later teachings attempted to soften his message by turning him into an exception, someone divine in a way no one else could emulate. But his inner circle remembered differently. They wrote that he urged every student to practice the sequence daily, not as ritual, but as remembering. He told them that the noise of the world would always try to pull them back into forgetfulness, but each return to recognition strengthened their clarity. Authority grew naturally. Command became less about miracles and more about living in alignment. Elias never spoke as if he were special. He spoke as if humanity had forgotten its architecture. The source does not send permission, he told them. It sends being. Everything beyond that is noise. Most people never learn this simple truth. Command is not the act of reaching upward. It is the act of standing inward. Elias didn't teach his circle how to pray. He taught them how to operate. And the moment someone understands that, the noise begins to lose its power. The practice was never meant to be mystical. Elias described it not as a ritual, but as a biological and perceptual shift that humans were designed to enter naturally. Over time, that shift became buried under layers of conditioning, fear, and interruption. But for those who learned it, the sequence unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability, recognition, authority, command, and then something even more subtle, reception. Not the receiving of blessings, but the receiving of confirmation that the call had actually landed. His students always asked the same question: how do we know it worked? They were used to a world where prayer was measured in silence, where answers were coincidences, where hope replaced evidence. Elias refused that uncertainty. He taught that the monad leaves traces, not in lightning bolts or visions, but in shifts so precise and repeatable that once someone learns to notice them, they never mistake them again. He called these the receipts, and he described 3 of them. The first was what he called the descent of the heart, though not in any poetic sense. It was literal. A sudden, deep tranquility settling beneath the sternum, like awareness sinking into a chamber that was always there but rarely inhabited. Students described it as a dropping sensation, as if their consciousness slid from the head into the center of the chest. From that moment, thinking stopped feeling like pressure. Fear lost its edge. Time softened. Elias explained that this wasn't emotion, it was alignment. When someone calls the monad correctly, their awareness anchors, and the body responds instantly. The second receipt was interference. He warned them repeatedly that after calling the monad, the noise would push back. Not as possession or attack, but as sudden surges of distraction, irritation, self-doubt, or emotional turbulence. He said this wasn't a sign of failure, it was a sign of success. You only attract resistance, he said, when you start leaving the frequency they feed on. Students reported sudden arguments with family, unexpected memories rising to the surface, sharp waves of fatigue, or emotional spikes that made no sense. Elias told them these were not obstacles, they were signals. Proof that the call had disrupted old patterns. The third receipt was the quiet shift in probability. Elias refused to call it a miracle, though others later would. He described it as the world rearranging itself around the clarity of a transmitted command. Small events lined up. Doors unlocked. Conversations appeared at precisely the right time. Something that should have failed succeeded with unnerving smoothness. Not because of luck, he insisted, but because recognition alters the landscape in ways most people never track. When the call lands, reality updates its architecture around it. His students learned to recognize the receipts not as external signs, but as internal diagnostics. Elias told them that once they understood the system, they would no longer wonder whether the monad heard them. They would feel the alignment inside the body, the pushback from the noise, and the rearrangement of circumstances, all three unfolding like a sequence. One evening, during a gathering in a weathered stone courtyard, a student named Marin approached Elias with trembling hands. He confessed that he had done the sequence alone the night before, recognition, authority, command, and afterward, he felt a rush of emotion so heavy he thought he did something wrong. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he had encountered the backlash. The noise tries its hardest right before it loses you, he said. That heaviness was the last grip. Marin nodded slowly, realizing the interference was not punishment but release. Elias rarely spoke of the backlash in dramatic terms. He emphasized that it wasn't a cosmic battle, just a natural friction created when an old pattern breaks. But he warned them not to interpret emotional turbulence as failure. You cannot rise without shaking loose what clings to you, he said. The more intense the interference, the more complete the shift. Later that night, as the group practiced under dim lanterns, Elias guided them through the sequence. Recognition first, a soft internal turning. Authority second, a gentle, grounded stance. Command third, a whisper spoken with absolute clarity. Afterward, he asked them to remain still, to notice the micro-movements inside their own awareness. Some felt the descent immediately. Others encountered resistance. A few felt the improbable alignment of events even within the hour. Someone appeared with exactly what they needed, a message arrived at the perfect moment, or a problem dissolved without effort. For Elias, these weren't mystical wonders. They were calibration markers. And then he taught them something even more controversial, the lag. A period after the call where nothing seems to happen, and the mind begins to doubt. He warned them never to confuse the lag with silence. Reality is rearranging itself, he explained. You simply can't see the scaffolding from the ground. The lag was where most people quit. The noise exploited this, whispering doubt, impatience, fear. But Elias taught that the lag was sacred. The proof that the call was rewriting something beneath the surface. He also spoke of what happens when someone lives in the practice long enough. The receipts become subtle, then woven, then instantaneous. The descent stops feeling like an event and becomes a resting state. Interference becomes background static instead of a storm. Probability shifts become effortless, showing up as synchronicities that feel obvious rather than miraculous. This is what it means to live aligned, he said. Not perfect. Not supernatural. Simply aware. His students eventually wrote these teachings into coded manuscripts, hiding them in metaphors and symbols so the gatekeepers would not understand. They feared the councils would erase the practice entirely, and they were right. Over time, the 3 receipts vanished from public doctrine. The lag became interpreted as unanswered prayer. Interference was renamed temptation. Probability shifts were labeled miracles belonging only to saints. The architecture remained, but the map was buried. Yet the sequence survived in fragments, whispers in desert monasteries, symbols carved into stone, chants that disguised ancient instructions. And even now, anyone who performs the practice with clarity experiences the same receipts. Elias insisted that this was the real proof. Not belief. Not blind faith. Feedback. Recognition aligns. Authority stabilizes. Command transmits. Receipts confirm. And that is how a human being knows the monad has heard them. The teachings of Elias remind us that spiritual awakening was never meant to be distant, dramatic, or exclusive. It was designed as a natural posture of human consciousness, one that has been obscured but never destroyed. Recognition, authority, and command are not mystical privileges. They are the architecture of awareness operating the way it was originally intended. And the receipts, the descent, the interference, the probability shift, are the world's quiet way of showing that the signal has reached its destination. If you followed this story all the way through, you already sense the deeper point. None of this is mythology. It is a reminder. A return. A reconnection to something you've always carried. Elias's teachings survived because people across centuries recognized their truth not in doctrine, but in their own experience. When the heart drops into clarity, when old patterns push back, when reality begins to rearrange itself, something ancient and familiar awakens. This video is part of that awakening. A small restoration of something the world tried to forget. A reminder that the interface is still intact, and that the monad still hears, always. If this teaching resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the deeper explorations coming next. If you felt a shift in your chest while listening, like the video so YouTube knows this kind of content matters. And if you know someone who's been struggling with doubt, fear, or spiritual exhaustion, share this video with them. It might be the exact moment of recognition they've been waiting for.